Good evening. I'm Olivier Mellet, Handyman Director of the Clark Art Institute. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome you to the Clark this evening as we are honoring Dr. Bénédicte Savoy, the 2024 recipient of the Clark Prize for Excellence in Arts Writing. Tonight is the beginning of a whirlwind 24 hours as we will formally present the award in New York tomorrow. Bénédicte Savoy has been part of our Williamstown community for more than a week now and has participated in the Oakley Center discussion for her book, Africa's Struggle for Its Art, which is also a great collaboration between the Clark and the Oakley Center. The Clark Prize for Excellence in Arts Writing is presented in celebration and support of informed, insightful, and accessible prose that advances the public understanding and appreciation of the visual arts. Through the award of the prize, the Clark seeks to raise awareness for the importance of writing that bridges scholarly and popular interest in the arts and encourages the continued support of arts writing among publishers, editors, and the general public. Bénédicte joins an impressive cohort of previous recipients of the Clark Prize, including Linda Nochlin, Calvin Tompkins, Cobena Mercer, Peter Sheldar, Hal Foster, and most recently, Hilton Als and Ellen Molesworth. The Clark Prize recipient is chosen by a jury that includes writers, scholars, and museum professionals. I have the honor of chairing the jury, and it's a fascinating process. I extend my thanks to this year's jury's member, Susan Hudson, Professor of Art History and Fine Arts at the University of Southern California, Asma Naim, Director of the Baltimore Museum of Art, Sebastian Smee, the Pulitzer Prize-winning art critic for the Washington Post, Mark Gottlieb, our Halvorsen Director of the Williams College Graduate Program in the History of Art, Esther Bell, our Deputy Director, and the Martha Berman-Lip Chief Curator, and Caroline Fowler, the Staff Director of our Research and Academic Program. The Clark Prize is presented through the generosity of the Beinecke family through the Prospect Hill Foundation, and we are very grateful to Candice and Rick Beinecke, who have been stalwart supporters of the prize since its inception in 2006. Tonight, we have the great privilege of hearing directly from Bénédicte about her work and her thoughts on the cultural repatriation, a topic that is of great interest and importance in many countries around the world. Bénédicte Savoy's career is extremely impressive. She graduated in the prestigious École Normale Supérieure in France in 1996. She received her PhD in 2000 at the University Paris 8. But most of her career, however, has taken place in Germany. She has been teaching since 2003 at the Technische Universität Berlin, where she has been appointed professor in 2009. Bénédicte Savoy is an international expert in the ethics of ownership of cultural collections and research on the provenance of cultural heritage in the context of translocation of artworks. She started with studying heritage looted by French troops back during the Napoleonic Wars. We started early on this. She was part of the team who made the exhibition Vivant de Nom, the Eye of Napoleon in 1999. We crossed paths there. In 2016, she became the professor for cultural history of artistic heritage in Europe, 19th-20th century at the prestigious Collège de France in Paris, founded in 1530. In 2018, at the request of the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, she produced with Felwine Sarr the critically important, acclaimed, and debated report on the restitution of African cultural heritage. The same year, she published, along with co-authors, Acquiring Cultures, History of World Art on Western Markets, examining how the history of seizure, trade, and collecting from Asia, the Pacific, India, Africa, Australia, and the Americas built the foundation of public and private collection in Europe and in the US from the mid-18th century. Following the report in 2021, she published Africa's Struggle for its Art, History of a Post-Colonial Defeat, Savoy, examined the effort of African nations in the 1917 and 1880s to recover object taking during colonial occupation. In 2021, she was named by Time magazine with her collaborator Felwine Sarr as part of Time's 100 most influential people. That same year, she was named Chevalier de la Légion d'honneur. So tonight, we add a little bit of that to this accolade by honoring Dr. Bénédicte Savoy, the 2024 recipient for the Clark Prize for Excellence in Art Writing. Please join me in welcoming Bénédicte tonight.
Dear Olivier Mellet, dear Christophe Connet, dear wonderful teams, fellows, and graduate students from the Clark, from the Williams College, and WICMA that I've had the pleasure of meeting these past few days, dear Clark Prize jury members, dear colleagues, dear all, thank you so much, Olivier, for your kind and overly generous words. And thank you for awarding me the prestigious Clark Prize, which I feel is like a knighting by my peers across the ocean. More than just a prize, it feels like an adoption. Before I begin my talk, I want to express or to explain why I feel so privileged to be here. On the very first day of my stay, I was welcomed by a scene that felt like a marriage between nature and culture, between the present day and the Napoleonic era, my favorite era. I was struck by the deep, soulful eyes and gentle face of the young artist painted by Le Thiers in 1799, set against the breathtaking autumn landscape, the vast sky, and the beautiful light that fills your place. And shortly after, in the forest, I saw something I had never seen before, and of course thought it was a bear. Right after filming that video, we looked each other in the eyes. It turned out to be a porcupine. These two moments, the young artist's face in the sky and my eye contact with the porcupine, were truly overwhelming for someone like me. And for that, thank you from the bottom of my heart. But let's begin. Thinking about absence in museums. We are in Venice in 1952. The refectory of the San Giorgio Maggiore monastery has just been restored by the Cini Foundation. The black and white photo shows the elegant Palladian architecture. The windows are evenly spaced. The geometric balance of the room is emphasized by the soft distribution of light. The frontal perspective draws us in, guiding the eye to the back wall, a smooth surface framed by a frieze on the top and wood paneling at the bottom. But within this frame, there is nothing to see. It wasn't always like this. As many of you know, a huge painting hung here from the 16th to the 18th century, the Wedding Feast at Cana by Veronese. It remained there for over 200 years until September 1797. At that time, commissioners of the French Revolutionary Army of Napoleon Bonaparte seized the painting as war booty. It has been in the Louvre in Paris ever since. As you can see in this photo from the Louvre, for a long time, this painting was one that the public quite literally and mostly turned its back on as it was placed opposite the Mona Lisa. This picture of from the 50s doesn't just show the absence of the painting. It reveals the presence of that absence. Since my early studies on Napoleonic looting from the perspective of the dispossessed, I've encountered the phantom pain caused by such cultural losses. Instead of healing, the wounds of cultural dispossession seem to deepen over time. That is one of the insights that has accompanied my professional life to this day. Since I've been living and working in Berlin, I have become accustomed to carry out most of my work as part of a team. With my colleagues, you see here, partly from my university in Berlin and partly from the University of Chang in Cameroon, over the last 3 years, we have carried out a vast survey which has culminated in the publication of this Atlas of the Absence, l'Atlas de l'Absence, of Cameroonian cultural heritage in Cameroon and its presence in Germany. In the course of this investigation, which required a great deal of hard work, we were able to reveal that for the first time, the overwhelming presence of 40,000 pieces of Cameroonian heritage in Germany's public museums today, forming as many voids in the cultural geography of Cameroon. In my talk tonight, I'd like to look closer with you at this dialectic of presence and absence in European museums, which is not only about the presence and absence of objects, but also about missing words, about the will or the unwill, and the ability or not ability to confront this dialectic. This dialectic is only a small aspect of the vast restitution debate we've been witnessing for around 5 years now in Europe, which feels like a cosmos of interconnected issues. Presence and absence, but also other questions touch on matters of epistemology, borders and mobility, history of violence, cultural and racial justice, etc., etc. My presentation today is divided into 4 parts, each around 10 minutes long and connected with moments from my own academic journey. And you have to know that I changed all my presentation after having discussions on yesterday and the day before yesterday with you and with Laure de Margerie, Olivier. First, amnesia, discretion since 1800, presence of absence, relationality are the 4 parts. Amnesia. I am 6 years old. It's June 1978 in Paris. My parents have a TV. For French children in the 70s, it was a daily ritual to sit down with their parents every evening to watch the news, followed by commercials, then off to bed. I'm sure, even though I can't prove it now, that on June 19th, 1978, at 8 p.m., I was sitting in front of the TV with my brother and our parents. On TF1, the main national channel, the news was presented by Roger Giquel, a big star. He had a new style, not just presenting the news, but also giving his personal take on it. Every night, millions of viewers tuned in to hear him. He was the voice of France. When he died in 2010, the newspaper Libération ran the headline, La France en pleurs. France is in tears. But Roger Giquel isn't really gone. He's still alive in the INA archives, the National TV Archives in France. That broadcast from June 1978 is still there, and it reminds me and us where we come from and what moves me and maybe you today. Listen closely to what millions of French people, including children like me and my brother, heard that night over 40 years ago. It was about the restitution of non-European artworks to their countries of origin. A few days before, UNESCO Director General Amadou Martin Mbo had called for this, for restitution.
Mais quelle distance, quel fossé entre cette information que je viens de vous donner et l'appel du directeur général de l'UNESCO, M. Mbo, pour que reviennent dans leur pays d'origine les œuvres d'art qu'ils ont perdues dans des circonstances de l'histoire qu'il vaut mieux ne pas trop décrire.
So, what does this old clip from the French news tell us? First, that more than 40 years ago, the topic of restitution, something we think now is so new and some even find dangerous, was already a hot topic, publicly discussed. Second, in Europe, the decision to return, to restitute these objects didn't seem that far off. And third, and maybe it's the most important, there was clearly something hidden behind these words, something that wasn't easy to talk about. Listen again.
Des circonstances de l'histoire qu'il vaut mieux ne pas trop décrire.
At this point, Giquel made an odd gesture, waving his hand in the air as if brushing it off, trying to calm things down. His eyes, usually fixed on the camera, dropped for a moment, lost in historical circumstances that shouldn't be too much specified. Des circonstances de l'histoire qu'il vaut mieux ne pas trop décrire. Live on TV, you could see the discomfort, almost as if Roger Giquel was physically uneasy about what he was saying. I was 6. My brother was 4. And today, our whole generation is in the middle of our adult lives. What could we understand from that sentence and that gesture back then? What did we make of this call to not know and not want to know? What were these historical circumstances anyway? For the adults of that time, my parents sitting next to us on the couch, my grandparents upstairs, the neighbors, our teachers, the message was clear. Giquel was talking about the colonial period when France systematically took not only natural resources, but also cultural objects from the territories it administrated. Back in 1978, that colonial history was still fresh in many people's minds. The Year of Africa, when 17 African colonies gained independence in 1960, was only 18 years earlier. The wars in Algeria and Indochina were still recent memories. A simple nod was enough. Let's not talk about it. We know what happened. It was less colonial amnesia than something like a conspiracy of silence. I prefer to think of it as a family secret. The adults just needed a hint. They understood. For us children, however, the phrase meant nothing. Then came the commercials, and we went to bed. A few years later, Europe entered the long era of Helmut Kohl in Germany and François Mitterrand in France. My high school didn't have a common room. When a class was cancelled, the students split into two groups. The cool ones, who drank coffee or pretended to, went to Café Julienne around the corner. The rest of us, including me, didn't like the taste of coffee yet, so we went to the Centre Pompidou, where entry was free. We spent hours exploring the bright, spacious rooms of the Musée National d'Art Moderne there, but what we loved most was being inside the artworks. We'd lose ourselves, the boundaries of our bodies, sitting in Jean Dubuffet's Jardin d'Hiver, Winter Garden, a huge epoxy cave with organic white shapes and bold black lines that sparked our imagination and gave us a sense of protection. Or in Joseph Beuys' Plight, a 1985 installation that created a suffocating space with man-sized felt rolls on the walls and a grand piano in the center. I'm sure you knew this piece. Immersing ourselves inside these works, we stepped outside our own reality to merge with what surrounded us. Our presence inside the art allowed us to feel absent from ourselves. For some, those hours at the Centre Pompidou felt like a second birth, a symbolic awakening to the world of art, a journey into adolescent metaphysical divagation. Shortly after, I dedicated my first academic work to the painter Anselm Kiefer. I was no longer living with my parents. I studied German literature in Berlin. In May 1994, Mitterrand and Kohl met for the 63rd Franco-German Summit in Mulhouse in Alsace. Strangely enough, in the Automobile Museum, you can see an old car in the background there. Not really good to see, but it's an old car. On this occasion, Helmut Kohl officially restituted 28 Impressionist paintings to France, including this Claude Monet in the middle, La Route de Louvciennes, which is now in the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Rouen. Most of the restituted works had been stolen in occupied Paris by a Nazi officer, likely from Jewish families, and were kept for nearly 50 years in a museum in East Germany. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1889 had made the restitution possible. It was now 1994. At that time, the topic of Nazi art theft in Europe and how hundreds of artworks from Jewish families ended up in state museums wasn't openly discussed in either France or Germany. Neither Kohl nor Mitterrand mentioned the Nazis or the Jewish families in their speeches. The restitution was meant to be a symbol of Franco-German friendship. Mitterrand's speech has been preserved. It is an extraordinary source for understanding the silences from which we come. You can read the original speech in French here, and I have added an English translation read by an automated voice. Merci, ChatGPT.
Mr. Chancellor, I will continue in the style you have chosen yourself, dear Helmut. This return to France of artworks, which are well known to represent an exceptional quality of our heritage, constitutes a truly extraordinary gesture on the part of Chancellor Kohl and the government of the Federal Republic. Everyone here will recognize its significance and its strangeness. Until now, museums, all the museums of Europe, I won't say elsewhere, as that would be too broad, have been filled with works acquired or conquered under conditions that do not need to be emphasized. I know of very few cases where a country receiving artworks of such wealth considered returning them to a friendly country. Isolated works, exceptional pieces, yes, but a collection of 28 paintings of this stature, no. I am sure that the French people as a whole join me in expressing thanks to you for an exceptional gesture, exceptional gratitude.
The idea of restitution as super strange, the belief that it is better not to dwell on the provenance of artworks in European museums, described here as places filled with pieces acquired under violent or questionable circumstances, and the tendency to omit the Holocaust and its connection to museums were all typical of the 90s in Europe. In recalling this episode, I'm not criticizing the past or accusing someone or anyone of failures, but rather trying to understand where we, the adults of today, come from when we think about absence in our museums. Absence is more than just missing objects. We encounter gaps in memory, untold stories, and deep silences surrounding our collections. When Mitterrand spoke those words, with all the authority of his office and its age, he was 78. Kohl was 64. They knew their jobs. Historical transparency about the history of these paintings seemed risky to them, perhaps because it could have revealed how many European museums benefited from the persecution and destruction of European Jews before and during the war. Or maybe because it might have exposed the collaboration between certain French and German figures in the art market and museums at that time. Or maybe it would have shown the public, like me, that our beloved museums, our cultural heritage, are also archives of darkness, not just beauty. No, dear Helmut, let's not talk about it. Let's keep the lid closed and move forward. Mitterrand's speech continues.
That being said, how many curators in our countries, how many directors of our major museums must be feeling a certain unease this evening? What if this were to become widespread? I don't think I'm taking much of a risk in believing that this example will remain very specific and that the contagion will stop rather quickly. And as all our museums in Germany, France, and Europe follow the fate of our Europe, that is, the increasingly widespread feeling that this is a shared heritage, each of us, wandering here or there, opening the doors of a museum in Europe, will feel at home.
For Mitterrand in 1994, the restitution of paintings stolen by the Nazis from Jewish families in France felt like a disquieting disease. Disquieting because it contradicted the European narrative he and his generation, for good reasons, had been building since the 50s. Building Europe was their goal, and the price was the deliberate hiding and silencing of uncomfortable historical truth, even in art, museums, and beauty. I was 6 years old when the message on state television was to avoid talking about colonial origins of non-European artifacts in European museums. I was a young adult when François Mitterrand asked Helmut Kohl not to push the restitution of Nazi-looted art too far, confidently asserting that museums had always been filled with works obtained under conditions we don't need to dwell on. I belong to a generation of Europeans who grew up on the thin ice of these and other family secrets about museums, and not just about museums, by the way, there were even more difficult historical issues. Now, I ask myself, how stable are collective social structures and institutions built on such fragile foundations, on the active, even cynical exclusion of whole generations from uncomfortable historical knowledge? At that time, I had always loved museums. I knew what I owed them and why I loved them. I was already a French-German hybrid, and maybe that's why I wanted to know. I became a museum historian. Discretion since 1800. As many of you know, between 1794 and 1811, revolutionary France, followed by Napoleonic France, confiscated thousands of works of art, manuscripts, precious books, and even state archives from European countries occupied by its armies. On this drawing, by Benjamin Six, you see the removal, enlèvement, de la galerie de Cassel, enlèvement at this act, removal, of looting was euphemistically called at the time. Kassel is a German city, and the gallery was looted in 1807 by Dominique Vivant-Denon, the guy here in the corner, who was at that time the director of the Louvre/Musée Napoléon. This aggressive policy of cultural appropriation was justified by a bold, if not twisted, doctrine claiming that works of art and science, as products of the genius of freedom, should be liberated from the enemies of freedom and brought back to the motherland of freedom. That's France, of course. Officially, these objects were meant to promote public education and advance the arts. However, this accumulation of intellectual and artistic capital also represented an accumulation of symbolic power and real financial capital. In 1810, the French Ministry of Finance, represented by the young Henri Bell, there, later known as the writer Stendhal, here on the right, urged Louvre/Musée Napoléon director Denon, shown on the left here, to finally start cataloging the museum's vast collection. The goal was to create a comprehensive record of all the works of art confiscated since the French Revolution, both in France and abroad, and now held at the Musée Napoléon/Louvre. There is a letter in the Louvre archives from October 1810. In this letter, Bell wrote to Denon, Monsieur, je suis passé chez vous pour vous soumettre le modèle ci-joint de procès-verbal. Nous pouvons décrire en une ligne un tableau quelconque, si beau et si pittoresque qu'il soit. Même la transfiguration. Notre travail n'aura pas la beauté pittoresque, mais il aura la beauté administrative, la clarté et la brièveté. At that time, even a temple of beauty like the Louvre had to adhere to the bureaucratic and statistic logic of the Napoleonic state. Art and aesthetics had to be framed within a cold administrative system. For the government, the purpose was quite concrete. They needed to understand the financial capital tied to this accumulation of artistic heritage. The attached draft of the inventory sent by Bell to Denon was an empty table, 9 columns, printed on large, heavy paper, serving as a template. Each page began with a column for the item number, followed by columns for the artist's name, a description of the subject, dimensions, origin, estimated value of the work, very important, prix de l'estimation de l'œuvre, estimated value of the frame, of pedestal, current location, and at the far right, remarks. None of the columns were wider than 7 centimeters. And since the titles and vertical lines separating the columns were pre-printed, there was no room for art historical divagation or poetry. This was the birth of the modern museum database, or Excel spreadsheet. There were debates over the origin column. The museum director suggested using provenance, but the finance department insisted on origine. A look at the completed pages of the catalogue, or Inventaire Napoléon, shows that origin wasn't used in an art historical sense, like assigning works to geographical schools, but as a political term. Entries like Conquête 1806, Conquest 1806, or Conquête 1809, or Couvent des Bénédictins de Saint-Georges-les-Majeurs à Venise, referred to the trophy status of the objects after they were seized by France, acting as a kind of pedigree and influencing the value, the estimated value. This detailed inventory was, of course, intended only for internal museum use and government administration, not for the public. In fact, during the Napoleonic era, the museum was very secretive about the origins of the works. That's why many foreign visitors at that time complained about the lack of information. For example, Ludwig Völkel, a museum director from Kassel, the city we saw, praised the Louvre/Musée Napoléon for its academic value, but criticized the absence of provenance details. Manches unbekannte oder nicht genug gewürdigte Kunstwerk erlangte dem ihm gebührenden Ruhm, wenn auch der Ort, woher es genommen war, fast immer verschwiegen oder nicht genau angegeben wurde. We sense here the museum director regretting that the attention of the Parisians had not been directed towards the treasures of the beautiful city of Kassel. However, on the French side, these omissions were significant in order to avoid provoking restitution requests. At that time, the European intelligentsia, including big stars like Goethe, in the middle, the brothers Grimm, Jacob Grimm, on the far right, Antonio Canova, the colored one, Helmina von Chesy, Quatremer de Quincy, there, but also Russian and British intellectuals and more people shared their views on how France's aggressive centralization of European heritage in Paris was transforming cultural geography. They discussed the massive presence of artworks in Paris, the absence left in dispossessed cities, and the future of the arts in Europe. When Napoleon was exiled in 1815, The question of restitution or of returning the European artworks gathered in Paris sparked heated debates across Europe, including in Russia. The texts from this period form the first transnational corpus of work on restitution. They are really helpful for understanding today's debates on cultural injustice or justice and the restitution of colonial collections. Many were published in Paris in the 1990s, notably by Marianne Dupuy-Vachet, here, and Pierre Rosenberg, without whom I wouldn't be here today. And so I want to dedicate them this Clark Prize. Among the hundreds of pages on restitution from 1815, one document stands out for linking France's imperial Napoleonic logic with today's post-colonial discussions. It's a famous letter by Viscount Castlereagh, the British Foreign Secretary who helped manage the coalition that defeated Napoleon, advocating for restitutions. In this letter, Castlereagh highlights the link between museum collections, imperial fantasies, and the post-imperial trauma of becoming a small country again. He writes, these spoils, I hope you can read it, impede a moral reconciliation between France and the countries she has invaded. But whilst these objects remain at Paris, constituting, as it were, the title deeds of the countries which have been given up, the sentiments of reuniting these countries again to France will never be altogether extinct, nor will the genius of the French people ever completely associate itself with a more limited existence assigned to the nation under the Bourbons, it means after Napoleon. The idea is that if you have works of art from former colonial or occupied countries at home, you will permanently think about reuniting these countries with you. It's the argument of Castlereagh. For me, this sentence is key. It shows how, even today, collections from former colonies in Europe not only fuel colonial nostalgia or neo-colonial arrogance in the countries that hold them, but also keep dispossessed countries dependent on the former powers that control their cultural heritage. I would like to show you two short film excerpts to illustrate the perspective of the dispossessed now. The first is You Hide Me from 1971, shot in the basement or filmed in the basement of the British Museum in London by the great Ghanaian filmmaker Nii Kwate Owu. A film I rediscovered during my research for the book Africa's Struggle for Its Art, and that has since been integrated into Isaac Julian's impressive installation Once Again from 2022, as you can see here in London. Instead of a film clip, because the film of Nii Kwate Owu is protégé, I'm going to play you a very short excerpt from the soundtrack performed by Nii Kwate Owu himself in 1971.
This is the basement of the British Museum. This is where they keep their vast collections of African art, tools, furniture, musical instruments, and clothes. We are going to have a look at what they have in their collections. Similar collections can be found in museums in all former colonial powers in Europe and America. Because Europe and the United States have the most important collections of objects of art from Africa, they can feed back to Africa a certain image of what is traditional African art. They say that the material is more easily accessible in Europe, but accessible to whom? Many books on African art are being published in Europe and America, but these books cannot replace the material that is now being kept outside Africa. Why should Africans, including African artists, only be able to read about their own works of art in books written by white people?
This passage needs little commentary. Already in 1971, Owu described the almost exclusive presence of African heritage in Western museums as a form of taking away the ability to form an image of ourselves, with that image shaped externally and reflected back like a distorted mirror to the regions of origin. Another recent example, in her new film Dahomey, Mati Diop, who won the Golden Bear at the Berlin Film Festival this year with this film, features students discussing the return of royal treasures that were violently looted by French colonial troops in 1892 in the now Republic of Benin in West Africa. One of these students describes heritage dispossession as a hostage taking of memory which becomes filled only with external references.
Savez-vous que des milliers d'œuvres béninoises se trouvaient hors du pays? Si oui, à quel moment de votre histoire vous l'avez su?
Pour répondre à ta question, je vais dire que durant mon enfance, j'ai grandi avec Disney, j'ai grandi en regardant Avatar, j'ai grandi en regardant Tom et Jerry, mais je n'ai pas grandi en regardant un film de dessin animé qui est centré sur Béanzin, qui est centré sur notre héritage culturel. Donc du coup, durant mon enfance, je n'ai pas eu vent de ce qu'il y a eu des œuvres qui nous appartenaient, qui ont été déportées et qui vont revenir on ne sait quand. Donc du coup, j'ai grandi dans l'ignorance de ce que mon patrimoine, ma culture, mon éducation, ma vie, mon âme est restée à l'extérieur pendant des siècles. Est-ce que vous comprenez?
This passage as well speaks for itself. The issue of the presence and absence of works looted during the colonial era goes far beyond the mere physical movement of objects from A to B and from B to A. From the perspective of the dispossessed, it is deeply connected to questions of memory, self-constructions, and even the writing of one's own history and narratives. If I'm correct, Dahomey will be released in the US on October 25th, and I warmly recommended you to go see it. It was selected by Senegal for the next Oscars, and I wouldn't be surprised if it wins the Best Foreign Film Award. I keep my fingers crossed. Presence of absence. This is a fulgurite. A fulgurite, from the Latin fulgur, meaning lightning, is a rare mineral formation created when lightning strikes sand or loose sediment. The intense heat from the lightning creates these unique formations which capture the path of the electric discharge. On November 28th, 2017, I felt like I had been turned into a fulgurite while crossing a street in my Berlin neighborhood. We all know those moments when a major information becomes so tired to where and when you first hear about it that you remember it for decades. For me, it's things like Michael Jackson's death in 2009, hearing the news while going through airport security in Lyon after a conference organized by my dear colleague Anne Lafont on women in art history at the Musée des Beaux-Arts. This time, it was not Michael Jackson. It was because of a speech by French President Emmanuel Macron in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. In that famous speech, Macron, hoping to improve France's damaged image in West Africa, announced that he wanted to restitute part of Africa's heritage that is kept in French museums.
Je veux que d'ici 5 ans, les conditions soient réunies pour des restitutions temporaires ou définitives du patrimoine africain en Afrique.
I never thought that in my lifetime, a French president would speak so directly and openly, even using the contagious term of restitution. This was particularly striking, given that just a few months earlier, France had harshly refused a request from the president of Benin to return the treasures from the kingdom of Dahomey. In 2016, the French government's response was, under current law, these cultural assets are subject to the principle of inaliénabilité, imprescriptibilité et insaisissabilité. Inalienability, imprescriptibility, and the immunity from seizure. Therefore, restitution is not possible. En conséquence, leur restitution n'est pas possible. What followed not only changed my life, but also marked the beginning of a major global shift in how we discuss restitution, cultural heritage, and the presence and absence of this heritage, depending on whether you live in the Western world or in Africa, for example. It also brought attention to issues of cultural justice connected to racial justice, reparations, and repair. Together with Senegalese economist and writer Professor Felwine Sarr, whom you see here on the left, in the middle you have Franck Riester, the French Ministry of Culture at that time, Minister of Culture at that time. We were asked by Emmanuel Macron, here in the back, to write a report on the promised restitutions. We both, Felwine and I, accepted this mission impossible, putting out other work on hold for months. We felt the time was right to try to apply our knowledge and experience to try to make a real change. From March to October 2018, we visited French and international institutions and traveled to several French-speaking African countries. We paid for the trips ourselves to stay independent from the French authorities. For 8 months, we navigated through various spaces, real, symbolic, and imagined, as well as different times. We examined the past, tracing the provenance of African collection in Parisian archives and revisiting forgotten restitution demands from over 50 years ago. Here you can see some of the most important African voices advocating for restitution after independence, such as the archaeologist Ekpo Eyo in the middle, from Nigeria, or Amadou Makhtar Mbow from Senegal, Amadou Makhtar Mbow with here, the second one from right, the first African General Director of UNESCO in Paris. We engaged with the present, having intense conversations with museum professionals, politicians, artists, and activists on both continents, and visiting African museums like the brand new Musée Royal de Fumban in Cameroon. Where's Violette? Yes, your destination. The most impressive museum I've ever seen, shaped like a giant spider wrapped by 2 massive snakes. We also focused on the future, working with lawyers to draft a legal framework for the restitutions and discussing with African colleagues how to reconnect with objects that had been gone for decades but might soon return. One of the most profound experiences for me was a physical one, feeling the absence of African objects in their original locations and then seeing them a few hours later after a night flight in French museums. Here is the empty palace of Abomey in Benin. The next day, we saw the objects taken from there by the French army in 1892, which were then displayed at the Musée du Quai Branly and have now been returned to Benin. That physical experience of seeing objects in European museums and their absence in their places of origin was so powerful and life-changing that ever since I've kept repeating it. I'll show you two examples of this physical experience of presence and absence. First, the bust of Nefertiti, which is here in its Berlin museum 2 years ago and now, and how it's displayed at its original site in Tel El Amarna, near El Minya in Egypt, where I was in November 2022. There, you will find a poor quality replica of Nefertiti high up in a glass case, while a guide explains approximatively that it has been taken to Germany.
حطوه في صندوق واتمضى من ضمن الورق ضمن الاثار اللي طالعه رسمه كانوا بيروحوا يجيبوه. الاثار دي قبل الاربعينات كانت في البعثه العلميه اللي بتشتغل زي الاجيال اللي بيحفروا في الارض بياخدوا جزء 20% من الاثر. بس المفروض انهم ياخدوا جزء ما يكونش نادر. لكن دي معناها كانت قطعه نادره موجود منها زيها بس مكسر ومش نظيفه زي دي. بس غطوها جبس على انها زي الموجود عندنا كله وطلعت ايه صفرا.
This gesture went to Germany. Another example is the Pergamon altar, or altar of Zeus, which has been in Berlin since the 1870s. It originally stood on the Acropolis of Bergama in modern-day Turkey, where a small museum is now dedicated to it. The Acropolis is over there. That's a museum. In both cases, poor replicas, models, or old photographs spark interest, but also create unsatisfied curiosity and confusion because the connection to the originals is so abstract for those who may never have the chance to see the originals in Berlin, especially due to the current to Europe's restrictive and Germany's restrictive visa policies. Issues of cultural justice are inseparable from questions of mobility and borders, as well as the racisms associated with them. From this repeated physical experience of the presence of absence, I gained two insights. First, too many museums in Europe today, especially the wealthy museums in Berlin that I know well, instead of functioning as places of connection and relationality, considering their vast collections and the city's cosmopolitan population, remain sites of separation, control over interpretation, retention of knowledge and objects, and mortifying intellectual hierarchies. Secondly, transforming these physical experiences of presence and absence into an academic method became urgent and crucial to me. I'm almost done. Relationality. The Atlas of Absence was born from this sense of urgency. Published a year ago, it is still a key focus for my colleagues and myself, for our team. We worked on this project between the University of Chang under Professor Albert Guaffo in the so-called grassfields region of Cameroon. It's the campus of Chang, and at my university in Berlin. Our investigation began with this hypothesis. In present-day Germany, there is a phantom Cameroon, a term inspired by Michel Leris's well-known anti-colonial book, L'Afrique fantôme. Over 40,000 objects from Cameroon are currently held in German public museums, making it the largest collection of its kind in the world. However, since the German colonial period, which lasted 34 years from the Berlin Conference to the end of World War I, these objects have mostly been stored away, unpublished, and unknown. The little that is on display is presented in a disturbing way, as I will explain in 1 minute. At the same time, in Cameroon, the memory of these objects has in part faded. Yet in some cases, it has been carefully preserved and passed down through generations. For this collective project, we traced for the first time the invisible, or in some cases, traumatizing presence of Cameroon in German museums. At the same time, we explored the forms and consequences of the absence of cultural heritage within several regions of Cameroon itself. The collaborative work felt like an unexpected expedition into the deep layers of European knowledge systems and unquestioned certainties into terminologies, epistemologies, and paradigms. It was truly unsettling, difficult, and exhausting work. We spent several months in Germany sifting through disturbing and violent colonial military reports, as well as museum records full of errors, inconsistencies, racist terminology, and explicit references to violence. For example, here we see an archive entry for a drum today located at the Rautenstrauch Joust Museum in Cologne and attributed to the Cameroonian Bakoko people. It states, sehr große Trommel, schwer zu haben, nur mit Gewalt zu erlangen. Big drum, hard to obtain, only obtainable through violence. We repeatedly visited the pesticide-contaminated storage rooms of ethnological museums and used ice training spreadsheets to track down the over 40,000 inventory numbers of objects from all regions of Cameroon that survived the destruction of World War II in Germany, as a considerable number has been destroyed forever now. But one of the most re-traumatizing experiences for our colleagues was visiting the Cameroon Room or the Cameroon Galleries at the Humboldt Forum in Berlin, a new reconstruction of the Baroque palace of the Prussian kings, which the newspaper The Guardian once described as an imposing Disneyland castle minus the fun. The facade appears Baroque, but inside the Humboldt Forum feels like an airport. We ascend into Africa and right after the escalator arrive at Cameroon. The room is filled with door frames and architectural elements from royal palaces taken by German colonial troops around 1900 after the palaces and villages were burnt down. An oversized photo on the wall reminds visitors of these violent events. The The room feels like a memorial to the burnt villages. Due to public pressure in recent years, the museum has placed provenance information at ankle height. Visitors have to bend down to read about the horrific circumstances that led to these magnificent palace elements being displayed in Berlin. But when you do so, when you try to read these labels, as one visitor noted on YouTube, this happens.
And if you come too near, then you always can hear wee, 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 wee. I think when I was there, I heard it at least 10 or 15 times. And wee, 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 because they come too near these objects, and then you hear the alarm, the sirens, and isn't it great?
It's really disturbing. So you get the historical information with this very uneasy tone of alarm, and yes. If its display is hard for us European visitors to bear, it's easy to understand that for people of Cameroonian origin, who often have a direct connection to or even come from the villages once burned by the Germans, but now rebuilt, like Baham or Banjul. That's the royal palace of Banjul a few months ago. For them, for these kind of visitors, it's even more challenging. In fact, the museum makes no connection to present-day Cameroon. It presents a lifeless world which undermines the works themselves, crushing them under the weight of history and preventing them from telling any story other than the violence they endured. It also reduces visitors from Africa or Afro-Germans to mere scenes of physical violence and humiliation once again. On the other side, in Cameroon, we met with scholars, museum professionals, activists, artists, and several traditional kings and their entourage. We understood that no one here was and is willing to be victimized, instrumentalized, or give up their agency because of this German memory and museum politics. This includes my dear colleague, Dr. Richard Tsogang-Fossi, seen here on the right, and PhD candidate Irene Machinda, pictured here in one of the courts of the Palace of Batoufam, who have these colleagues who have become very dear friends of mine, and I'm grateful for everything I've learned thanks to them. For example, in recent years, I have learned to speak less and to listen more. And that is why, in conclusion to my talk, I would like to give the floor to one of my young and brilliant colleagues, Foga MC Cornelius Refem, a PhD candidate in Potsdam near Berlin and a member of the Nzo people of Cameroon, whose royal heritage has been in Berlin and Stuttgart for over 100 years. Foga belongs to a generation in Germany that doesn't hesitate with great politeness to make it clear when it's better for you, for me, to stop talking. Reflecting on the endless discussions we had during our work on the Atlas of Absence, when we began to question the term object, which seems too passive to describe things that, from a Cameroonian perspective, possess unique powers, personalities, and even agency, Foga subtly criticized the substitute terms we had considered, like subject or entity. His elegant critique lasts just 1 minute. For me, it's one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard in recent years. It makes clear that there is still a significant epistemological task ahead of us, to integrated categories of knowledge and meaning that museums, in their obsession with separation and categorization, are currently unable to accommodate. And above all, it confirms that the time has come to be silent and to listen.
So instead of talking to you about agencies and why they're agencies because they have a soul and a spirit, this is a coffee mug. And I think this also answers the question of what is going on in Cameroon with regards to restitution. This is a coffee mug. This is a pen. Now, if I put both things into relation, the cup has started gaining some kind of agency. It's producing a sound. Now, if I hit this rhythmically and I sing, "Oh, Jamansa Kengele, oh," this is one of the songs that people sing and saw to remember colonization. In fact, within it, it's engendered a demand for restitution. Now, the argument about the agency of the cup or about the agency of the subjects is not just that agency is inert within them. The agency is relational. I hit it with the pen. My voice accompanies it, a certain rhythm, sound, meaning, names. Agency is relational. We cannot argue, therefore, that these objects have agency within European museums if they are not put back in the relations that engender that agency.
Thank you.